Now, without further ado, I want to introduce Dale A. Jenkins. He explained when we chatted last week why he includes his middle initial so as not to be confused with another Dale Jenkins. Dale's had a lifelong interest in the Navy and international affairs. He served for 3 years as an officer in the Navy, mostly on a destroyer in the Pacific. Um, During activity, he was home ported in Yokosuka. Tough, tough duty. And his Pacific Fleet commitments took him into the Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Uh, while in active duty, he was awarded the Naval Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal. So that must have been in the late 60s. I seem to recall that event as everybody headed north into the North China Sea. Was um, As a result of his active duty experience and recent new revelations, Dale provides fresh insights into strategies and tactics of the Battle of Midway, which took place a mere 80 years ago. Dale lives in New York City. After a career mostly in banking, he served for 5 years as a staff director of the Council on Foreign Relations. His forthcoming book, Diplomats and Admirals, provides a unique insights into diplomatic events that led to Pearl Harbor and the strategies and tactics of the naval battles that followed, including Wake Island, New Guinea, the Doolittle Raid, Carl Sea, and of course, culminating in the Battle of Midway, which he will discuss this evening. Dale has degrees in history and business from Harvard and Columbia universities. Dale, welcome to the Continental Commandery Naval Order of the United States virtual lecture series.
Thank you.
It's a delight to have you. So, what in particular inspired your particular interest in the Battle of Midway?
All right. Well, here we go. Going back to last November, we had a talk on the period prior to Pearl Harbor, the growing confrontation with Japan, and how, while there might have been a settlement at the last minute, we were coerced into an ultimatum with Japan by China, and the Japanese empire would shrink from Taiwan and Korea and part of Manchuria all the way back to the islands itself, and no one could see at that time that the big power in East Asia was going to be China as a result of all of that. Now, I want to set the stage with some state-of-the-art technology. It's a long time ago now, it's 80 years. Our carriers look different. This is our Dauntless dive bomber. It's actually over the carrier Saratoga. These are Dauntless dive bombers on the stern of a carrier. Here is a torpedo plane, despite its name, Devastator. It was obsolete. And this is what we went into the Midway battle with. You could barely do 100 knots with a torpedo. You see the torpedo underneath here. Our torpedoes were really World War I vintage. They did 30 knots. The Japanese torpedoes, which were all oxygen powered, could do essentially 50 knots, but that's what the state of play was at the time. Anyway, that's the Devastator. Here's a bit of an action shot. Here's a plane coming in on a carrier. Ideally, they're coming down the center of the deck. This guy was far off the center. He looks like he's trying to get back. Right here, you see the landing signal officer right on the edge of the carrier with his paddles trying to guide him in. Here's a destroyer, hopefully could pick up a pilot that goes in the water. Here's a Japanese Zero. Some people thought it was the best fighter in the world at the time. Fast, highly maneuverable, and deadly. Here's the Enterprise. It was most decorated ship in World War II, created further the immortal name of Enterprise. Here are Japanese carriers. Sorry, these aren't better shots, but this is the Kaga here. They have white stripes running down the length, so the pilots have a better orientation. Here's a big red spot near the bow. Up here is Ikagi, and you see the very small superstructure. They had one deck, which was shared by both ship officers and flag officers. They didn't have flag bridge and command bridge the way we did. Now, here we're getting to some of the personnel. This is Admiral Yamamoto. He built the Japanese carrier fleet and planned the Pearl Harbor attack. This is the Pacific Ocean, as we can all see. The Japanese carriers came over here, struck Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, returned. One division went down to support the Wake invasion. The rest of them, and all of them, went back to Japan. Then soon after that, they came down to Truk and supported invasion of Rabaul, which became a major base for them. Then, surprisingly enough, they moved over here, went into, did a raid on Darwin, went into the Indian Ocean, raided the British Navy here around Ceylon. Zero shot down an entire squadron of British fighters. They sank a lot of shipping. And then by April, and this was perhaps to cut off the Burma Road, it's not quite clear, they came back through the Strait of Malacca and came up here, and Yamamoto was going to settle with the Americans and particularly sink the carriers that had escaped the Pearl Harbor attack. Two of the carriers were assigned to come around to the Coral Sea and support the invasion of Port Moresby. This was the first part of May. It turns out that, let me go back. It turns out that we had been hard at work decrypting Japanese messages, and we found out they were going to come. So Yorktown and Lexington under Frank Jack Fletcher was in the Coral Sea, and this led to the Battle of Coral Sea, May 3 to May 8. At the end of the Coral Sea battle, we had lost Lexington, and Fletcher had to come back trailing oil to Pearl Harbor. But far more serious than that was that the two Japanese carriers, while not sunk, were disabled. One had taken 3 dive bomber hits, and the other one had lost so many planes that it was out of action for the Battle of Midway. So Yamamoto went into the battle with 4 carriers instead of 6. You wonder why he did that? Very good question. Here's Admiral Nagumo. He was not a carrier admiral at all. He had come up through cruisers. He got to be he was promoted to vice admiral in 1939, was one of the senior vice admirals by the time 1942 came around. And the Japanese promoted and made assignments on the basis of seniority. So he was in command of the striking force of what was 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor, was going to be 4 carriers at Midway. He never learned the details of carrier operations, never understood how to spot planes on deck, never knew what was going on the hangar deck underneath. He had a couple of staff officers that bailed him out when things got tough, as they did in the Indian Ocean. But he was the carrier commander going into the Battle of Midway. Now on the other side, here's Admiral Nimitz, a late picture of him. He's got 5 stars. He was told by, this is jittery, I'm sorry, Roosevelt, get out to Pearl Harbor and don't come back till the war's won. That's what he proceeded to do. While he was there early on, he built the morale of the fleet, and he set up a decryption operation so that we could get a good idea of what the Japanese were going to do. This was Joe Roquefort, one of the unsung heroes of the Navy in World War II and certainly of the Battle of Midway. He assembled a group of people that were Japanese linguists, and they worked 18, 20 hours a day decrypting messages. And he's the one that figured out that the Japanese were coming. They were going to invade Midway. They were going to come from the northwest. They were going to have 4 carriers, and they were going to set off an attack on the 4th of June at first light in the morning. Here's Halsey, who was supposed to be the carrier commander at Midway. He had been underway ever since Pearl Harbor. He had been to Samoa, and these distances are huge in the Pacific, 2,500 miles to Samoa. He met up with Fletcher there. They put some Marines on Samoa. They went up and raided Marshalls and Gilberts. Halsey went on to Marcus, raided Marcus, went back to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz wanted him to be the commander of the Doolittle raid. He went north, met the Hornet coming out of California. They moved all the way across the Northern Pacific. April 18th, 1942, 80 years ago today, was the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. Went back to Hawaii to get ready for the Midway attack. And King in Washington said, no, the Coral Sea battle is going to be later. I want Halsey to take command of the Coral Sea fleet. And he was ordered to go all the way back to Coral Sea, 3,500 miles. Couldn't possibly get there in time. Coral Sea was fought by Frank Jack Fletcher, and 3,500 miles all the way back. And by this time, he's getting messages from Nimitz saying, things are hot, please make all possible speed. Enterprise and Hornet arrive at Pearl Harbor in good shape, except for one huge error and unfortunate event. Halsey is exhausted. He's been underway constantly for 6 months. He's lost 20 pounds. He's contracted a case of dermatitis. Nimitz takes one look at him, sends him to Pearl Harbor Hospital. The most senior and capable carrier commander is going to sit out the Battle of Midway. So what to do? Halsey recommends his screen commander, Spruance. Nimitz approves of that. and Spruance becomes the commander of Task Force 16. Task Force 17 under Fletcher is now just has one carrier, the Yorktown, and that's the makeup of our force going into Midway. This is Fletcher. Now we have a battle plan. Thanks to the work that Rochefort did, Edward Layton, Lieutenant Commander, has put together a battle plan. They know the Japanese are coming in here. He knows the course 135. The speed is going to be 25 knots. That's what they can do. Consolidation of force. And the idea here is that we will set off PPY planes and we will encounter the Japanese fleet at about 0600 on the 4th of June. The Japanese will have launched their planes against Midway at 0430 in the morning. They will have launched their scouts, and we will have launched our scouts, the PBYs, also at 4:30. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, 0600, the expectation is we'll find the Japanese carriers. At that point, the planes from Midway will take off and fly to an interception point. The Japanese carriers will move about 35 miles and meet the interception point, which was expected to be 140 miles northwest of Midway. The carriers were to be at 140 miles, and we would have a concentration of force and meet the Japanese carrier force here. We would meet them with half their planes because half of them were down attacking Midway. Now, the carriers were to be 200 miles north of Midway, and this was their navigation point. That's where they were to be. And if you have a boy or a girl student in junior high school, you can ask them to review the Pythagorean theorem with you, and you'll find out that if you take the numbers here, 140 here, 140 here, it converts into 200 miles. How do we know that 200 miles was the real target for the carriers and not just something that was a hypothetical? This is the SINCPAC Fleet Action Report, June 15th, 1942. It was secret, it was declassified. I've been to the Bethesda archives and seen, this is the original document with a C.W. Nimitz signature with the tabs down the side, ABC, they correspond to this. This is the enclosure that Frank Jack Fletcher made, and it states here, Enterprise and Hornet. That's too hard to read. I've transcribed this. Enterprise and Hornet maintained air groups in readiness as a striking force. During the night of June 3/4, both forces proceeded to a point 200 miles north of Midway. Reports of enemy forces to the west of Midway received Midway and Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. The location of the enemy occupation force, but not the striking force. The reason for that was that our PBYs went out the day before, June 3rd. They found the amphibious force that was several hundred miles away. The striking force was under clouds and they were not seen. Now, we are at 0430 on June the 4th. The Japanese have set off their attack on Midway. scouts have gone out looking for anything that might be there. They don't expect to see anything. This is a jittery, so I'm sorry about this. Our PBYs fly up here and they find the striking force and they radio a course and a position, a course and speed. They were a little bit off on their the accuracy of their navigation, but it didn't really make any difference. The planes from Midway took off and they were flying here, intent on meeting the Japanese carriers at about 0700. Straight north of Midway, 200 miles, was here. This is where the carriers were supposed to be. They were not there. They were over here, 60 miles away. You can see them on the upper, my cursor is there. These are the carriers, they're 60 miles away. They are beyond their operating distance. Our operating planes had a operating distance of 175 miles. This was 140 miles. Another 60 miles meant that they were out of range. Fletcher sent Spruance a message: proceed southwest and attack enemy carriers when discovered. So Spruance takes a course to the southwest, starting at 0607. He's moving at 25 knots. It's going to take an hour to get to 175 miles from the Japanese force. At that point, he's going to have to turn into the wind and launch his planes. So let's go back to what's happening with the Japanese fleet. Our planes are arriving at 0700. The concentration of force has failed. They're on their own. The Japanese Zeros, they launched 30 Zeros. We've got 6 B-26s. We've got 4 Avengers, and the Avengers are shot down. 5 of them are shot down. 1 escapes. They drop torpedoes. They don't have a chance of hitting anything. The B-26s, 1 is shot down. They drop 2 torpedoes that they do 30 knots. The Japanese carriers could do 34 knots. They just turn away. The last B-26 is on fire. He's not going to make it back. He says, if I'm going to die, I'm going to take out the Japanese flagship. And he's heading straight for Nagumo on the bridge of Akagi. At the last minute, he veers off and goes into the ocean. The Japanese on Midway, attacking Midway, have run into heavier opposition than they expected because Midway has built it up. So they say another attack is required. At 7:15 in the morning, Nagumo orders the Japanese carriers to change their munitions from anti-ship, which they were carrying because there was a chance they might run into a opposing carrier or opposing fleet. He orders them to change to point detonating munitions. Now this sounds like something you just, to Nagumo, you just do. The fact is, you had to take the torpedoes down 18 feet long. They weighed 1,500 pounds, get them on a dolly, put them on a rack, try to get point detonating bombs up. At 7:28, it's important to keep track of these times. At 7:28, one of the scouts who's been on the move since 0430 says, I've found 10 ships. Types of ships not disclosed. What to do? They could launch whatever they had on them, whether it's torpedoes, bombs, whatever kind of bombs, get an attack off. Nagumo stands there, not knowing what to do. 15 minutes go by. 15 minutes in a carrier battle is a lifetime. Finally, at 7:45, he says, reverse the order and put the torpedoes back on the planes. Talk about pandemonium on the hangar decks of the Japanese carriers. At 8 o'clock, our Marine Dauntlesses come in and do a glide bombing attack. They're not trained to do high diving attacks. They're strictly glide, and the Zeros shoot half of them down. At 08:20, the scout sends another message and says, there seems to be a carrier in those 10 planes. And at that point, it's a real crisis. Yamaguchi, the second in command of the Japanese fleet, says, let's have an immediate attack. To have an immediate attack means that the planes flying back from Midway at the conclusion of their attack are going to have to ditch in the water. Nagumo thinks about that and says, no, we will land the planes coming back from Midway, and then we will turn. It takes about 3/4 of an hour to turn the planes to 091 at 09:17. The Nagumo turns the carriers towards the northeast. Meanwhile, what's happening with our planes? They're launched, they're flying down. Here's the Enterprise planes, here's the Hornet planes. They don't know anything to do other than, sorry about this, they don't know anything to do but find the interception point, because there's been no follow-up scouting on the part of the Americans. 0603, they had a report. Now it's 0917, 3 hours later, there's been no subsequent scouting. The torpedo planes from Hornet think there's something wrong, and they're going to go in and they're going to make an attack. And here's the Torpedo 8 from Hornet moves in and makes an attack, and they're all shot down by the Zeros. Enterprise torpedo planes see smoke on the horizon. They make an attack, and out of 15 planes, 12 are shot down, and there's no attack is successful on the Japanese carriers. The rest of the Hornet planes deviate off. They pass the point where they expect to see the Japanese carriers, And Commander Ring, the commander of the Hornet Squadron, thinks that maybe he better get between Midway Island. He goes down. Here's his after action report. He cuts through the expected course of the Japanese. He goes down towards Midway. He comes back this way to cut through the expected dead reckoning course. At this point, his planes are running out of gas. Some of them head for Midway. Some of them go back to the Hornet. His fighters, for the most part, are running out of fuel, and they're ditching in the ocean. Here's Commander McCluskey, commander of the Enterprise Air Group. And here's the Enterprise action report. And you can see they're coming down here. They cross the dead reckoning spot where they expected to see the carriers. And McCluskey has some thoughts about something similar to what the torpedo planes from Hornet thought. There's these carriers have been under attack earlier in the day. They've probably had to maneuver. They've been slowed down where they're not here. So the chances are we should retrace their course and follow back. And if we retrace their course, we'll eventually find them. He flies for about 20 minutes, reversing the course, doesn't find anything. He knows they can't be south of here. He thinks that perhaps by this time, their scouts have found the U.S. carrier forces in case they probably would have closed. So he starts a search up this way, northeast. He finds a destroyer following the Japanese carriers. And all of a sudden, there are the Japanese carriers right underneath him. He's got 2 squadrons of dive bombers. One he designates for the Kaga. For the other one, he designates for the Akagi. And here is the Akagi under attack. Dick Best, the squadron leader, is probably the one dropped his bomb. He's got a squadron mate, another squadron mate here. And in the background, you can see Kaga under attack. While this is happening, the Yorktown planes, which have been scouting, find the other 2 carriers, and they launch an attack. The problem there was that one of the dive bomber squadrons has been held back on Yorktown just in case one of their scouting planes had found another Japanese carrier somewhere else. So the Yorktown Air Group commander, a guy named Bax Leslie, designates 2 carriers to be attacked, but he's got only 1 squadron. The Soryu is attacked, 4 bombs go on Soryu, and it's wiped out. The Hiryu is the other, sorry about this, the Hiryu is the other carrier, and the torpedo planes attacked Hiryu. The Zeros shoot them all down except for 2, but this time there's some defending fighters, or Wildcats, and for the first time, a couple of Zeros get shot down. The Hiryu is saved. So the planes go back to Hiryu, and Yamaguchi is the commander on you. Finally, by this time, it's about 10 minutes to 12, 11:50. He launches an attack of dive bombers against Yorktown. Here's the Arab battle over Yorktown. Yorktown takes 3 hits, goes dead in the water. Here you can see a dive bomber, a Japanese dive bomber, and there's ferocious air fighting over Yorktown. The planes go back, the Japanese planes go back to Hiryu, and they're armed. The torpedo planes by this time are ready to fly, and they launch an attack against Yorktown. By this time, it's about 1400, 2 in the afternoon, and they're successful in firing 2 torpedoes into Yorktown. Yorktown takes a list. Sailors in the engineering spaces are killed, and Fletcher has to evacuate and turns command over to Spruance. Spruance takes command. They get 25 dive bombers from Enterprise to attack the remaining Japanese carrier, which is Hiryu. Here's a huge hole in the front, in the deck, and near the bow, and Hiryu is demolished. So at this point, 4 Japanese carriers are destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto is back on his battleship. He's devastated, but he's not defeated. And he says, we can still beat the Japanese, beat the American carriers in a night battle. And he orders the 2 carriers that have been with Hiryu to move to the east at all possible speed. And if the American carriers follow up and make an attack, he will meet them with his battleships. Back on board Enterprise, some of the staff officers are telling Spruance, look, this is the chance to maximize the victory. And somebody's even quoting Clausewitz and saying, the greatest victories come against a defeated enemy. Spruance has other thoughts. He knows that he's defeated the Japanese carrier fleet. There's nothing else out there that's worth pursuing. He's also aware of the Japanese capabilities with night battles. He wants to be in the vicinity of Midway in case the amphibious force would still try to make him the landing. So despite the advice he's getting from some staff officers, he orders the American carriers to take a course to the east at 20 knots. Yamamoto is moving through the night. He's predicting that if he can encounter the carriers, it'll be about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Lookouts with the best night vision binoculars in the world sweep the night horizon where the very dark sky meets the black ocean. The faintest shape, the tiniest pinprick of light would mean there was something out there, like the superstructure of a ship over the horizon. There was nothing. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Yamamoto realizes that his attempt to have a night battle has failed. He sends an order out to the entire fleet, reverse course and move west. The remnants of the huge Japanese fleet would be pursued over several days with comparatively minor action. But when Admiral Spruance turned the carrier force to the east, late in the day on June 4th, the Battle of Midway, for all intents and purposes, was over. I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you, Dale. It was excellent coverage of the buildup, and it's amazing in this day and age where we've got satellites covering the globe, and there's no place to hide. In 1942, even fleets that were only a few hundred miles away were invisible to one another. At that point, is it correct we did not even have rudimentary radar on our ships?
The American ships had radar. It did not seem to play a particular role in the battle. They picked up planes coming in early on with the radar on Midway, saw the Japanese attack. There was against them. There was some. It was more useful at Coral Sea actually, but they did spot the attacks coming in from Hiryu, maybe 30 miles away. It helped because the Wildcats from 3 U.S. carriers were able to mobilize over the Yorktown and played a very constructive role defending Yorktown. The Japanese, of course, did not have radar.
Right.
And that was they had, they trained for night battles. They had flares, they had starlights, they had developed night vision optics to a high degree. They had searchlights, but they had no radar. The distance here, by the way, was about 100, where the battleships, the Hiryu battleships would be around here. And the distance over to where the American fleet was probably about 130, 140 miles. If Spruance had moved west, there would have been a relative speed converging, 25 knots from Yamamoto, 20 knots from Spruance, 45 knots of relative speed, and the Japanese would have encountered them somewhere around 10 at night, covering the 140 miles in about 3 hours. Spruance was not drawn into that. One of the great decisions of the battle and of the war, really.
We have a question from one of our remote watchers. To what extent did the Japanese naval doctrine contribute to their defeat? Because the idea, one of the thoughts is they were kind of guided by doctrine and thereby less flexible.
Yeah, to a very significant degree. First of all, Nagumo should not have been the commander. They did have, there was an admiral named Ozawa who was really carrier qualified. It should have been Ozawa and not Nagumo. Things might have been different, you never know. When he had to decide on going back to the rearming with the torpedoes, he had jumped into a decision to I'm sorry, because I'd have even used some of the slides here. He jumped into the decision to change the armaments to be able to attack Midway again. But once he realized that he was in trouble, he fell back on doctrine. Instead of launching an attack with whatever armaments was on, which was on those carriers at 0728 when the first report came in, he didn't do that. He felt the necessity to go back to doctrine and rearm his planes with the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that were on their original. So, yeah, I would say that the doctrine, in several ways, played a role.
Another question is, there's been a tremendous amount of ink spilled about the Battle of Midway. What was the most surprising thing that you've discovered that you plan to relate in your upcoming book?
My upcoming book, what?
What is the most surprising thing that you discovered while doing the research for your book that hasn't really been picked up by previous authors?
Yeah, well, no doubt about it. The plan that Nimitz made for the concentration of force. He knew 7 days before the position, the course, and speed of the Japanese attack. 0400 or 4th of June, 0430 in the morning, they were going to be launching their attack. He had 7 days to prepare for that. He was not going to just sit there and wait for something to happen. He was not going to send the Midway planes in by themselves. There were only a few Midway planes. The carriers had, between them, each carrier had 3 squadrons of dive bombers. That's a total of 6 squadrons of dive bombers. They had 3 squadrons of torpedo planes. They had 3 squadrons of fighters. That was going to be the concentration of force. And had that worked, had our carriers been in position, had they executed that properly, this battle might have been over by 0800 in the morning, because they would have been there at 0700 in a concentrated attack, and it did not happen.
Do we know why the task forces 17 and 18 were so far out of position? Was it weather related? Was it poor navigation?
I don't know. I wish I knew, but I don't.
Okay.
It could be that, and Fletcher did carry on. You see this, by the way, this chart is thanks to Samuel Eliot Morrison. It's out of his book. And I just wanted to show it to show a perspective, because it's very much the same as the chart that was published by the Naval War College, authored by Richard Bates. You see the attacks of the Hornet, the Enterprise torpedoes. You see McCluskey going through the expected contact point, going northwest, and then attacking, going to the northeast. That's very much similar to the Naval War College chart. Up in here, when you see, look at the U.S. track, the Yorktown had executed a search on their own. It's been kind of rushed to get all this information in what turned out to be about half an hour, 35 minutes. But Fletcher was carrying on a search, because when the first report was made from our scout, he reported 2 carriers and 2 battleships. There was 50% cloud cover. He only saw 2 carriers. He only saw 2 battleships. If there was a chart here showing the disposition of the Japanese carrier force, he had clearly flew over the northwest edge of the carrier fleet. They had a disposition of 8,000 yards apart, so he only saw part of it. That's why he reported 2 battleships, 2 carriers. Spruance was smart enough to realize that he probably only saw two uh, carriers. It probably was another two that he didn't see, but he was not going to send one uh, air group against two known carriers. If it meant sending another air group somewhere else, he wouldn't do that. But meanwhile, Fletcher had conducted his own search up here to the north. You see this arc on Samuel L. Morrison's chart. He carried on his own search, and he was uncertain, and perhaps for some reason he was uncertain about whether there could be another uh, carrier force. Now, why he couldn't do the search from 200 miles north of Midway is a question that I still would have. It wasn't necessary to go 65 miles to the east. He should have carried out the search.
A couple more questions as we get to the end of the hour. One is, how did the Aleutian operations affect affect the fight at Midway? How did the Aleutian operations affect the fight at Midway?
I don't think it affected it at all.
Okay. Here's one about your choice of topic. Of all the naval engagements across U.S. naval history, what compelled you to write about the Battle of Midway?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Ever since I was in the Navy, it's a long time ago now. People, across the United States, every year we have the celebration of June 6th, 1944, the Normandy invasion. Well, I have all the respect in the world for the men that went ashore. A lot of them got killed. It had to happen. But the war was pretty much won by that time. And I've said to people, you celebrate D-Day, June 6, 1944, and you should celebrate it, but you're 2 years and 2 days late. The real battle, the turning point, when things could have gone either way, was at Midway, June 4th, 1942. That's what started me on this whole thing.
Okay.
And I've gone from there back to Coral Sea, back to Pearl Harbor, and all the way back to the things we talked about last November. So all of that is in my book, 110,000 words, coming out in September, October.
You anticipated my next question. So who will the publisher be? And
I'm going to self-publish.
You're going to self-publish. Okay.
Now, I'm doing this because I think I've created an historic record. I don't want an agent telling me, well, you should change this, you should delete that, or having a publisher do the same thing. I'm going to self-publish, and I hope it to be a bona fide, respectable historic record.
Well,
then we talked about 200 miles north of Midway.
Yeah, we hear, bravo, Dale. I'm anxious to read the book. And to that point, when you have the book published and it's ready to be promoted, send John and me an email, and we'll make sure it gets broadcast to our companions and posted on our LinkedIn page.
Okay. Well, I think that's appreciated, and I think that people will find it interesting. I certainly hope so.
Great. Well, we're coming up at the end of the hour. I want to thank you for a really fascinating presentation about the Battle of Midway and new bits that hadn't been brought to light, especially the piece where Nimitz sent out his orders in advance, and the plan was for the two task forces to be directly north of Midway, 200 miles, and one wonders how the attrition rate would have fallen had everybody been in position when they were supposed to be. Of course, that's all what the fog of war is about. So thank you very much for your
That's right.
presentation. Um, I want to let everybody else know, members of the Continental Commandery of the Naval Order, we're going to have our business meeting on Zoom this week on Wednesday evening. I will send out another reminder email tonight or tomorrow, and I hope that you will be able to join us for a focused business meeting. The real topic is how do we fulfill the Naval Order's mission as a virtual commandery with companions spread around the globe. So please join us on Wednesday for that. And with that, I want to thank everybody who participated this evening, who watched. I will be posting a link to the broadcast so you can tell your friends and colleagues to watch the video in our past events page at the Commandery's website. With that, I wish you all a great evening, great day. And again, thank you, Dale.
You're welcome.